A German soldier stares at the machine he spent 3 years learning to trust. The engine will not start. The fuel tank is empty. Somewhere behind him, the front is collapsing. And somewhere ahead, the enemy is closing in. He does the only thing left. He destroys the gearbox with his own hands, so that no one, not the Americans, not the British, not the Soviets, can turn his tank against his own country. Then he walks away. By May 1945, thousands of tanks like his sat abandoned across Germany. Panthers with jammed turrets, Tigers with no crew. Machines built to dominate a continent, left to rot in forests and factory yards. But the war for these tanks was not over. It was just beginning. Engineers wanted their secrets. Armies wanted their steel. And at least one of them, a tank feared across two fronts, would end up fighting for a country that did not even exist when it was built. What happened to the wreckage of Hitler's armored fleet was not a footnote. It was a second war, fought over Germany's abandoned tanks, and almost nobody remembers how strange it truly became. It's always an honor to have history lovers here. Where are you watching from today? Germany, May 1945. The guns had gone silent, but the roads still told the story of an army that had run out of everything except its own machines. Along the highways of the Ruhr, across the fields of Bavaria, and in the shattered outskirts of Berlin, thousands of German tanks sat exactly where their crews had left them. Panthers with their long barrels pointed uselessly at empty skies, Tiger IIs half buried in mud beside forest tracks, Panzer IVs parked outside factories that no longer had roofs. The armored fleet that had once terrorized entire continents now looked like a graveyard that stretched from the Rhine to the Oder. The smell of the roads had changed too. Diesel and cordite had given way to rust, wet ash, and the sweet rot of fields left untended through a spring nobody had time to plant. Farmers walking past a slumped Panzer IV in a ditch no longer flinched at the sight of it. The machines had become part of the landscape, as fixed and as harmless as boulders, though every soldier who approached one still felt a flicker of the old fear before reason caught up with instinct. The silence around these machines was almost worse than the sound of battle. For 6 years, the growl of a Panzer engine had meant something was about to die. Now the engines did not growl at all. Many would never growl again. Birds nested in open hatches. Rain pooled in turret rings that gunners had once kept spotless. A machine built to project terror across a continent could not, in the end, protect itself from a single season of neglect. The reasons were written into the metal itself. Fuel had become the German army's most desperate shortage in the final year of the war. Entire columns of tanks had run dry in the middle of retreats, abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because there was nothing left to burn in their tanks. Allied bombing had crushed the refineries and rail lines that once kept the Wehrmacht moving, and by early 1945 a Panther with a full magazine and a perfect gun sight was worthless if it could not move 10 kilometers. Bombing had done something else too. It had gutted the factories that built and repaired these vehicles. Crews scavenged parts from broken machines to keep a handful running, stripping radios, optics, and even entire engines from tanks that still looked whole from a distance. What Allied soldiers found in the final weeks of the war were often shells of vehicles, hollowed out by their own side long before the enemy arrived. And then there was the third reason, the one that unsettled the men who found it. Many tanks had not simply broken down, they had been killed on purpose, by their own crews. As German units collapsed and surrender became certain, soldiers destroyed engines and gearboxes with grenades, sledgehammers, or whatever tools were on hand. It was a final act of defiance, a refusal to let a machine that had carried them through years of war become a trophy for the men who had beaten them. A tank with a shattered transmission could not be driven away. It could only be studied or scrapped. Investigators could read this sabotage in the metal itself, the way a doctor reads a wound. A clean shell hole told one story. A gearbox smashed from the inside, bolts sheared and casing caved in by a hammer swung by hand, told another. These were not the marks of combat. They were the marks of men who had nothing left to fight with, except the will to deny their enemy one final victory, the sight of a captured panther rolling under a new flag. For the technicians who later tried to restore some of these vehicles, that stubborn defiance became their first and most frustrating obstacle. Allied forces moved quickly once the surrender was signed on the 8th of May. This was not simply cleanup. Military planners on all three sides understood that these abandoned machines represented something valuable, whether as intelligence, as raw material, or as leverage in the uncertain peace that was just beginning. Securing them became a priority almost overnight. In the American zone, technical intelligence teams fanned out to collection points such as Oberursel and Geldorf. Their job was methodical rather than dramatic. Soldiers with clipboards walked through fields of dead armor, recording chassis numbers, checking hulls for manufacturer stamps, and noting which components were missing. Every tank told a slightly different story depending on where and when it had been abandoned. A Panther found near a repair depot might still have most of its internal systems. A Panzer IV pulled from a roadside ditch outside a bombed town might be missing its engine entirely, cannibalized weeks earlier to keep a different vehicle alive during the retreat. The work was not without danger. Some tanks still carried live ammunition inside their hulls. Others had been mined or booby-trapped in the final chaos of the collapse, a grim inheritance from an army that no longer had tanks to fight with, but still had explosives to leave behind. Technical intelligence officers learned to approach every vehicle as if it might still bite. They worked in pairs where possible, one man circling the hull while the other checked the ground beneath the tracks. Since retreating engineers had sometimes buried mines directly under a vehicle they expected the enemy to inspect. A curious soldier who climbed onto a hull without checking the hatch first risked triggering a charge wired to the simplest tripwire, and that risk alone was enough to make methodical, unhurried inspection the standard practice across every zone. British forces carried out similar work through the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, known simply as REEM, who catalogued and recovered vehicles at sites including Senelager in the British zone. In the earliest weeks after the surrender, before the final occupation boundaries were fully settled, British and American technical teams also had brief access to sites further east, including the sprawling proving ground at Hillersleben near Magdeburg, where they documented heavy hulls and experimental wrecks before the area was formally handed over to Soviet administration in the summer of 1945, under the terms agreed at Potsdam. It was a narrow window, and everyone doing the work knew it. What was not recorded in those weeks might disappear behind a new and far less accessible border. Further east, Soviet trophy brigades carried out their own version of this operation across Silesia and into the ruins of Berlin itself. Soviet doctrine treated captured equipment as a resource to be gathered at scale, and trophy units moved with the same discipline as any combat formation, sweeping through former battlefields and depots to collect anything with military value. Where American and British teams often worked tank by tank, cataloging details for study, Soviet brigades thought in terms of tonnage, gathering vehicles by the hundreds for sorting later. Convoys of tank transporters and requisitioned rail cars moved west to east through the ruins of towns that had changed hands 2 or 3 times in the final campaign, hauling hulls past civilians picking through rubble for anything salvageable. 2 different kinds of scavenging happening on the same shattered streets at the same time. What all 3 armies found, regardless of zone, was a picture of a defeated military machine in a strange, unfinished state. Some tanks were almost pristine, rolled straight from a factory floor in the final days of production, their paint barely dry, their guns never fired in anger. These vehicles often lacked complete internal systems, radios not yet installed, sights not yet calibrated, because the factories building them had been bombed into partial paralysis before assembly could finish. Other tanks bore the scars of years of combat, welded patches over shell holes, replacement road wheels that did not quite match the originals, evidence of crews who had kept fighting machines alive far past what their designers had intended. Workshops attached to old depots sometimes yielded something almost as valuable as the tanks themselves: paperwork. Maintenance logs, deployment records, and repair schedules gave Allied officers a way to trace where individual vehicles had served and what units had operated them. This was intelligence that no amount of staring at a hull could provide. But the paper trail was incomplete by design. In the final weeks before surrender, many German units had deliberately burned their records, understanding that operational histories in the wrong hands could expose commanders to war crimes investigations, or simply hand the enemy a clearer picture of unit strength and tactics. For every workshop where investigators found a stack of intact logbooks, there was another where they found only ash in a metal drum. By the time summer arrived in 1945, the chaotic scramble to locate wrecked and abandoned tanks had given way to something more organized. Collection yards began to fill across all three occupation zones, rows of Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs parked wheel to wheel under military guard, waiting for someone to decide what would happen to them next. For the soldiers assigned to guard these yards, it was an eerie duty. Machines that had once represented the most feared armored force in the world now sat quietly in neat rows, disarmed, immobile, and utterly dependent on the decisions of the men who had defeated them. Nobody guarding those yards knew yet how varied those decisions would be. Some of the tanks parked there in the summer of 1945 would be shipped across an ocean to be taken apart bolt by bolt on a testing range in Maryland. Others would be melted down within 2 years to become steel girders in a rebuilt German bridge. A small number, remarkably, would still be rolling on active duty a full generation later, thousands of kilometers from the factories that built them. The war that created these machines was over. The argument over what to do with them was only just starting. For the young soldiers standing guard over these silent rows, there was something almost unbearable about the ordinariness of it all. Men who had spent years dreading the sight and sound of a tiger cresting a ridgeline now leaned against one to light a cigarette, bored, waiting for orders that would take weeks or months to arrive. The machines that had defined the worst days of their war had become furniture, and that transformation, from mortal threat to inert scrap sitting under a summer sky, was its own kind of victory, quieter than any battle, but just as final. As the Allies organized their occupation zones through the middle of 1945, the mission around Germany's captured armor began to shift. The scramble to secure and catalog tanks gave way to a quieter, more deliberate question. What could these machines actually teach the men who had beaten them? The United States and Britain in particular wanted to understand how German engineers had designed vehicles that so often outclassed their own tanks in firepower and optics, and where, despite that advantage, the German war machine had ultimately failed. Answering that question meant more than walking through a collection yard with a clipboard. It meant tearing these tanks apart. This was, in its own way, a continuation of a rivalry that had never really ended, just changed its tools. For years, Allied tank crews had traded stories about the terrifying moment a Tiger's gun swung toward them across open ground, or the sinking realization that a shell fired from 600 meters had simply bounced off a Panther's glacis plate. Now, the engineers who designed the next generation of Allied tanks wanted to know exactly why, in cold, measurable terms, those encounters had so often ended badly, and precisely what it would take to make sure they never happened again. For the United States, the center of that effort became Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, a sprawling testing facility that had spent the war evaluating American weapons and now turned its attention to the enemy's. Beginning in late 1945, the Army arranged for select examples: a Panther, a Tiger I, a Tiger II, a Jagd Panther, and several assault guns, to be shipped across the Atlantic. The journey itself was a strange coda to these machines' service. Cranes that had once loaded landing craft for an invasion now lowered German tanks onto cargo ships bound for a country most of these vehicles had never come close to threatening. At Aberdeen, engineers subjected the tanks to gunnery tests, mechanical trials, and detailed studies of armor penetration. Rounds were fired into hull plating at carefully measured angles to determine exactly how much protection German sloped armor actually provided, compared to the vertical plating still common on many Allied designs. Crews ran the engines under load, tracked fuel consumption, and timed how long it took a trained mechanic to service components that German factories had built for speed of production rather than ease of repair. A pattern emerged quickly, and it echoed complaints that Allied intelligence officers had already heard from captured German crews during the war. The firepower was excellent. The optics, built by manufacturers with decades of precision lens experience, were better than almost anything the Allies fielded. But the final drives and gearboxes failed constantly under sustained use, a flaw baked into designs that had been rushed into mass production under wartime pressure and never fully corrected. The men running these trials were not simply filling out reports. Many had fought against these exact types of tanks only months earlier, and there was a strange, almost personal quality to finally being able to climb inside a Panther without a crew waiting to fire back. Some described the interior as cramped and overly complex compared to American designs, crowded with dials and mechanisms that demanded a highly trained specialist rather than a quickly taught wartime conscript. Every hour spent running these vehicles through their paces added to a growing body of knowledge that would quietly shape tank design decisions for the next decade, even as the tanks themselves sat gathering dust between test sessions in a Maryland field far from anywhere they had ever been designed to fight. The British carried out a parallel study, though most of their testing happened inside Germany itself rather than requiring vehicles to cross an ocean. British engineers placed the Panther's long-sloped glacis plate and its powerful high-velocity gun directly alongside the Sherman and the Churchill, measuring penetration figures and comparing crew ergonomics inside each hull. Their conclusions largely matched the American findings. German optics drew consistent praise in internal reports, noted for their clarity and precision under field conditions. At the same time, maintenance crews assigned to keep captured vehicles running for testing purposes documented just how difficult German tanks were to service without specialized tools and factory-trained mechanics, a problem that had quietly undermined German armored operations for years, even when the tanks themselves performed brilliantly in battle. These British evaluations fed into early Cold War thinking about tank design, informing debates about sloped armor and optical quality, though they never led directly to Britain manufacturing anything resembling a German tank. British reports from this period read almost like an extended argument with themselves, admiration for the engineering competing constantly with frustration at how impractical that same engineering became once a vehicle needed to survive weeks of continuous campaigning rather than a single controlled demonstration. Officers who had commanded Churchills and Shermans through the hedgerows of Normandy now walked around a captured Panther taking notes, aware that the very qualities making it so lethal on paper had also, time and again, left German units stranded and helpless whenever supply lines broke down. The Soviet Union approached the entire question differently, shaped by both scale and philosophy. Soviet trophy brigades had already collected enormous numbers of Panzer IV, Panther, and Stu-gauge assault guns, and much of this captured armor found a second life not on a proving ground, but in training grounds, where new Soviet tank crews learned to identify, and if necessary destroy, the very vehicles they were now driving. Soviet test results essentially confirmed what Red Army tank crews had already learned the hard way during years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. Frontal armor was strong, main guns fired with impressive velocity and accuracy. But the mechanical systems wore out fast under harsh conditions, breaking down at rates that would have been unacceptable in Soviet designs built for a different kind of ruggedness. By the early 1950s, most of the German tanks still in Soviet hands had been scrapped, not from any philosophical decision, but simply because the supply of spare parts had finally run dry. In the meantime, thousands of young Soviet conscripts had spent hours crawling over and inside these captured hulls as part of their training, learning the silhouette of a panther from every angle so they would never mistake one for a friendly vehicle again. An ironic second career for tanks that had spent years trying to kill the very soldiers now practicing on top of them under far more controlled and far less lethal circumstances. Some of the most revealing discoveries during this period came not from tanks that had fought, but from tanks that never got the chance to. At sites like Kummersdorf, the old Wehrmacht testing ground outside Berlin, and at Hillersleben near Magdeburg, Allied technical teams working in the narrow window before final zone boundaries took effect found incomplete hulls and half-finished experimental vehicles. Among them were components connected to the Maus program, an almost absurdly oversized super-heavy tank that Germany had never managed to bring into real production, along with elements tied to the planned E-series, an attempt late in the war to standardize German tank design into a simpler, more rational family of vehicles. Neither program had gotten anywhere close to changing the course of the war, but the wreckage left behind told investigators a great deal about how desperate and scattered German tank development had become in its final years, chasing ever larger and more complex designs, even as the basic industrial capacity to build simple, reliable tanks was collapsing all around them. At Haustenbeck, inside what had been a Wehrmacht training area, British teams found workshops still holding damaged Jagdtigers, the enormous and rare tank destroyer built on the Tiger II chassis, alongside Panthers left mid-repair and crates of spare parts stacked and waiting for a war that had ended before they could be used. It was a snapshot of an industrial and military system caught completely off guard by its own collapse. Engineering effort and raw material poured into vehicles that would never fire another shot in anger. Workbenches still held tools laid out mid-task, half-finished repair orders left in place, the ordinary clutter of a workshop frozen at the exact moment its purpose disappeared, as though the war had not so much ended as simply stopped in the middle of an afternoon shift. These discoveries fed directly into a larger question that Allied planners could no longer avoid. Early occupation directives had already required that all German armored vehicles be reported, secured, and placed off limits to unauthorized use, a straightforward security measure in the immediate aftermath of surrender. But security was never going to be the final answer. Should these tanks be preserved indefinitely for further study? Should some be transferred to other nations as military aid or war reparations? Or should the entire fleet simply be destroyed, removing any possibility that German armor could ever again roll into a European conflict? Each occupying power pursued a somewhat different answer, shaped by its own priorities and resources. The United States, having built an entire testing infrastructure at Aberdeen, prioritized continued technical study. The Soviet Union gathered large stockpiles first and postponed final decisions about their fate. Britain, constrained by limited manpower and shipping capacity in a country trying to demobilize as quickly as possible, tested a smaller number of vehicles largely on site inside Germany rather than transporting them home in bulk. These were not abstract policy debates conducted from a comfortable distance, argued over conference tables far removed from the machines themselves. Every decision about a captured Tiger or an unfinished prototype competed for scarce resources against the far more urgent business of feeding, housing, and governing a defeated and devastated country. A colonel arguing for 6 more months of testing at Aberdeen had to justify that request against the same budget lines paying for coal shipments and food rations, and more often than commanders liked to admit, the tanks lost that argument, quietly reclassified from valuable intelligence asset to expensive, low-priority storage problem within the span of a single fiscal year. Across all 3 sets of Allied reports, though, the conclusions converged on a strikingly similar picture. German tank design had paired genuinely advanced optics and powerful main guns with maintenance-heavy engineering that never matched the demands of sustained industrial war. That mixed verdict shaped early Cold War tank development in subtle but lasting ways, encouraging renewed interest in sloped armor and higher quality optical systems, while reinforcing a hard-learned lesson about the value of simplicity and reliability over raw technical sophistication. It was a strange kind of vindication for the men who had fought these tanks without ever fully understanding why some broke down in the middle of a retreat, while others kept fighting long after they should have been destroyed. The tank that had seemed almost supernatural on a battlefield, appearing suddenly through smoke with a gun that could kill from over a kilometer away, now sat disassembled on a workshop floor, its flaws laid bare under fluorescent light. Fear, it turned out, had never been a reliable measure of engineering. The Panther that terrified an entire company of infantry could still be undone by a single worn bearing 200 kilometers from the nearest replacement part. By the time formal testing wound down, the Allies were left holding thousands of tons of armored vehicles, spare parts, and unfinished prototypes, a logistical and political problem that could not simply be ignored. Between 1946 and 1948, the Allied Control Council, the joint body governing occupied Germany, issued a series of directives ordering the systematic destruction of German military equipment. Tanks, armored hulls, and vehicle components were formally classified as prohibited materials under these directives, meaning they could not remain in German hands under any circumstances, and could not be preserved in any form that might support future rearmament. This decision triggered a wave of demilitarization that swept across the former Reich with an efficiency that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the war's final weeks. Industrial centers in the Ruhr, in Saxony, and in Thuringia became the focal points for this scrapping effort. Steel plants in Bochum, in Essen, and in Magdeburg received long lines of armored hulls, many of them delivered by rail directly from the collection depots established just months earlier. Workers who had spent the war years building armaments now spent the peace cutting them apart, using cutting torches and heavy machinery to reduce Panthers, Panzer IVs, and Stugs into manageable pieces of scrap. There was a bitter irony in the process that few directly involved failed to notice. The same industrial regions that had once forged Germany's armored fleet were now the ones dismantling it, piece by piece, on the very same rail lines that had once carried finished panzers away toward the front. Furnaces that had been calibrated during the war to pour precisely graded armor plate now simply melted whatever came off the rail cars, indifferent to whether the steel arriving that morning had once belonged to a training vehicle that never left Germany or a veteran hull that had fought from the Ardennes all the way back to the Rhine. Germany's severe post-war steel shortage made this recycling effort genuinely valuable rather than purely symbolic. Metal recovered from tank hulls went directly into rebuilding bridges, factories, and housing across a country desperately short of raw materials for reconstruction. By late 1947, hundreds of armored vehicles had been melted down entirely, leaving little physical trace of their wartime role beyond photographs and inventory records. There was something almost poetic, and something almost cruel, in the idea that the steel forged to conquer a continent was now being reshaped into the beams holding up a school roof or the girders spanning a river that German engineers had once blown up themselves to slow an Allied advance. Local workers cutting apart these hulls rarely spoke about the irony out loud. Most were simply grateful for the wages and the raw material, living in a country where food was rationed and winters were brutal, and a slab of armor plate was worth far more as a rebuilt roof than as a monument to a war everyone wanted to forget. Not every tank ended its life inside a steel mill. In some rural areas, Allied engineers repurposed abandoned German armor for practical engineering projects, rather than sending it through formal industrial recycling. One recorded case involved the Enns River in Austria, where at least one Panther and other armored wrecks were pushed into riverbank embankments. Whether as a deliberate stabilization measure or simply as a convenient way to dispose of an immovable hulk remains difficult to state with full certainty from surviving records. Similar disposal, using tank hulks as fill-in quarries or unstable ground, appears to have happened in scattered locations across Central Europe as well, though the full extent of this practice is harder to document precisely than the industrial scrapping figures. Over the years that followed, soil and vegetation gradually covered many of these remains, folding what had once been the most feared weapons in Europe quietly into the landscape itself. Decades later, unusually low water levels or construction projects would occasionally expose one of these buried hulks again, a rusted turret or a section of track emerging from a riverbank or a hillside, briefly startling a hiker or a work crew before being identified for what it was, a piece of the war that the ground itself had chosen to keep rather than release. Another significant share of surviving German armor met a different fate, as target hulks on military ranges. The British used captured tanks at ranges including Lulworth, the Americans at Grafenwohr and at Aberdeen itself, and Soviet forces at various training sites across their own zone and beyond. These vehicles allowed Allied crews to test new types of ammunition under realistic conditions, to practice gunnery against genuine armored targets, and to evaluate how emerging weapons and tactics would perform against the very machines they might someday face again in a different conflict. Once a hulk had absorbed enough damage to be useless even for target practice, it was either left in place on the range, slowly disappearing under weather and vegetation, or eventually broken down for whatever scrap value remained. Range crews grew familiar with the particular way each type of tank failed under repeated fire, a Panther's glacis plate deflecting round after round before a lucky shot finally found a weld seam, a Panzer IV's thinner side armor giving way far more easily, lessons that fed quietly back into the ammunition and gunnery doctrine each army carried forward into the next decade of tank design. Clearance operations continued for years in the regions that had seen the heaviest fighting during the war's final months. Czechoslovak and Polish teams worked through former battle lines, pulling wrecks out of roadside ditches, forests, and abandoned defensive positions where they had sat since the fighting passed through. Some of these recovered vehicles went straight to scrap yards. Others were incorporated into land reclamation projects, buried or repurposed as part of broader efforts to make war-torn ground usable again for farming or construction. In villages that had sat directly in the path of the fighting, the removal of a rusted hull from a field edge or a collapsed barn was often as much a psychological milestone as a practical one more visible reminder of the occupation and the war finally hauled away, leaving behind bare earth that could, at last, be planted again. Former research sites saw some of the most complete destruction of all. The incomplete prototypes uncovered earlier at places like Kummersdorf and Haustenbeck, including remaining components of the Maus program, partial E-series hulls, and various experimental chassis that had never reached anything close to production readiness, were systematically dismantled under the same Allied Control Council directives governing the rest of Germany's armored fleet. Whatever technical curiosity these unfinished machines had generated among Allied engineers in 1945, by the end of the decade the verdict on their fate was the same as for every operational tank still sitting in a collection yard. The scale of this demilitarization effort left remarkably few German tanks intact anywhere inside the country. Persistent stories occasionally surface even today about secret storage bunkers supposedly packed with pristine Panthers, or hidden warehouses somewhere in the German countryside still sheltering undamaged Tigers waiting to be discovered. Investigation of these claims, however, consistently points toward misidentified structures, exaggerated local legends, or rumors that took on a life of their own during the paranoia of the early Cold War. The available historical evidence simply does not support the idea that any significant hidden stockpile of complete German tanks survived this period of systematic destruction. Part of what fueled these rumors was the sheer scale and secrecy of the wartime dispersal program itself, since Germany really had scattered production and storage across hundreds of small sites in its final years, specifically to avoid Allied bombing, and a handful of those genuine wartime hiding places, once located, were more than enough to seed decades of exaggerated local folklore about the ones that supposedly got away. By 1948, The vast majority of Germany's once dominant armored fleet had been destroyed, leaving only a relatively small number of vehicles that had been preserved specifically for continued study or transferred out of the country entirely before the destruction directives took full effect. The force that had once rolled across the plains of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union in overwhelming numbers had, within only 3 years of the surrender, been reduced almost entirely to melted steel, buried hulks, and a handful of survivors scattered across a handful of proving grounds, and, as it would turn out, a small number of foreign armies just beginning to rebuild their own military strength from whatever equipment they could find. It was an ending that almost nobody who had faced these tanks in combat could have predicted. Not annihilation in one final dramatic battle, but a slow, bureaucratic dismantling carried out by clerks with inventory sheets and workers with cutting torches. An army defeated twice over, first on the battlefield and then again in the scrapyard. While most German tanks disappeared into furnaces or rusted quietly into riverbanks and quarry fill, a smaller but far more surprising number found something closer to a second career. These were the vehicles that slipped through the cracks of demilitarization, either because they had already left Germany before the destruction directives took effect, or because a foreign government judged them too useful to hand over for scrap, a matter of timing and paperwork as much as any grand strategic decision. Their post-war service stretched the working life of Hitler's armored fleet in ways almost nobody guarding those quiet collection yards in the summer of 1945 could have imagined, carrying German engineering into conflicts that had nothing to do with the war that built them. France moved fastest and furthest in this direction. French forces gathered surviving Panthers from depots across southwestern Germany in the final year of the war and folded them directly into the 503rd Combat Tank Regiment, a unit rebuilding French armored strength almost from nothing after years of occupation had gutted the country's own tank industry. French crews, many of whom had fought in whatever equipment the Free French forces could scrape together, were immediately struck by the Panther's firepower and its exceptional optics, qualities that outclassed much of what France itself could field in the immediate post-war years. But admiration wore thin quickly once the maintenance bills started arriving. Spare parts were scarce. Drivetrains were already worn from years of hard wartime use, and French workshops often had to cannibalize 2 or 3 vehicles just to keep one running for a single training exercise. Reports from the early 1950s described transmission failures becoming almost routine, and by 1951, France formally retired its last operational Panthers, unable to justify the growing cost of keeping such temperamental machines in service. Even so, those 6 years of French Panther operation left a mark, quietly shaping French armored doctrine at exactly the moment the country was rebuilding a modern military from the ground up. French officers who had commanded Panthers in the late 1940s carried those lessons directly into decisions about the country's next generation of homegrown tanks, favoring designs that balanced firepower against something the Panther had never quite managed, a vehicle that a mechanic in the field could actually keep running without a fully equipped factory workshop nearby. Czechoslovakia occupied a different position entirely, because it had spent the war as one of Germany's most important tank manufacturing centers, its factories building German designs under German supervision for years before liberation. After 1945, those same factories simply kept working. Czechoslovak plants continued producing the Hetzer, a compact and effective tank destroyer built on the Panzer 38T chassis, now manufactured for export under the designation G13. A significant number of these vehicles were sold directly to Switzerland, a country that had remained neutral throughout the war but still needed modern, affordable armor to defend its borders during the tense early years of the Cold War. The Swiss found the Hetzer's simple mechanics and reliable engine well suited to their needs, and the type remained in Swiss service for years afterward, a strange legacy for a design born entirely out of Nazi Germany's wartime industrial machine. Tucked into mountain valleys and reinforced firing positions along Switzerland's own borders, these small tank destroyers spent decades on standby for a war that, unlike so many of their German-built cousins elsewhere in the world, they never actually had to fight. A quiet retirement earned simply by belonging to a country that managed to stay out of every conflict that followed. Czechoslovakia also kept a number of leftover Panzer IVs and Stuga assault guns running domestically, before gradually replacing them with newer Soviet equipment through the 1950s. Across the rest of Eastern Europe, several smaller nations received German vehicles either as leftover wartime stock or through post-war Allied redistribution. Romania, which had spent much of the war as a German ally before switching sides in its final year, kept a number of Panzer IVs in service for training purposes. Bulgaria integrated a similar mix of Panzer IVs and Stugs into its early post-war armored units, working with whatever equipment happened to be available in a region still recovering from years of occupation and shifting alliances. By the middle of the 1950s, though, nearly all of these Eastern European users had transitioned fully to Soviet-supplied T-34s and other newer Soviet armor, closing the book on German equipment across most of the region within a single decade of the war's end. Spain's involvement began earlier and lasted longer than almost any other case. In late 1943, while the war in the rest of Europe still raged, Germany quietly supplied Francisco Franco's government with 20 Panzer IVs and 10 Stu-G assault guns, part of a broader relationship between the two regimes, despite Spain's official neutrality. These tanks became the backbone of Spain's armored force for roughly the next decade, operating alongside older and increasingly obsolete Panzer I light tanks left over from the Spanish Civil War. Even after newer equipment eventually took over the frontline role in the mid-1950s, Spain kept the aging fleet in reserve for another 10 years rather than scrapping it outright. As spare parts grew harder to source across that entire span, Spain's Panzer IV fleet gradually shrank through attrition rather than combat losses, the tanks simply aging out of usefulness one at a time. By 1965, more than 2 decades after they first arrived, Spain judged the remaining vehicles more valuable as an export than as a home defense asset, and that December 17, surviving Panzer IVs were sold onward to Syria. What happened next turned out to be one of the strangest final chapters in the entire story of Germany's abandoned armor. Syria placed these tanks, along with additional Panzer IVs acquired separately from Czechoslovak stocks, into frontline positions along the Golan Heights. These machines, built in German factories more than 2 decades earlier for a war against the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, first saw combat not in the 1940s, but during the Six-Day War of 1967, dug into fortified positions overlooking Israeli territory. Remarkably, some of these tanks remained emplaced and operational into the 1970s, making them very likely the last German tanks from the Second World War to see active combat use anywhere in the world, firing their guns in anger a full generation after the war that created them had ended, long after the men who first designed and built them had either died or grown old. It is a detail almost impossible to imagine, standing in a German collection yard back in the summer of 1945, watching bored guards lean against silent panzers, with no idea that a handful of sister vehicles, sold onward through 2 more countries, would still be defending a border a quarter of a century later. The very design flaws that Aberdeen and British engineers had catalogued so carefully years earlier, the fragile final drives, the demanding maintenance schedules, mattered far less to Syrian crews holding a fixed defensive line than they had to German commanders once trying to keep entire armored divisions moving across hundreds of kilometers of contested ground. A tank that never had to go anywhere could get away with weaknesses that had doomed its ancestors in the middle of a fighting retreat. Behind every one of these foreign deployments lay the same quiet, grinding problem: the scarcity of spare parts. Nations without direct access to German factories or design documentation improvised constantly. Mechanics fabricated replacement components from scratch when originals could not be found. cannibalized multiple vehicles to keep a smaller number running, and trained new crews without the benefit of proper manuals, most of which had either been destroyed in the war's final weeks or never made it out of Germany at all. Despite these obstacles, the tanks that did remain in service left a genuine mark on early Cold War military thinking in smaller nations, offering first-hand lessons in armored warfare to countries building their militaries almost from scratch. By the middle of the 1950s, most larger armies had moved on entirely, retiring their remaining German vehicles in favor of standardized equipment supplied through either the United States or the Soviet Union. The two emerging superpowers now shaping military alliances across the globe. The age of nations patching together mismatched fleets of wartime leftovers was ending, replaced by the more predictable logistics of Cold War alliance blocs. Meanwhile, the small number of Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs that had survived testing, war, and export found their final resting places not on any battlefield, but inside museum walls. Institutions such as the Tank Museum at Bovington in England, the Musée des Blindes in Saumur, France, and the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow preserved key surviving examples, ensuring that these machines, once scattered across an entire continent in various states of ruin, did not vanish from history entirely. It is a strange kind of ending for a fleet that once seemed unstoppable. Tanks designed to conquer a continent, now sitting quietly behind velvet ropes, studied by curious visitors who will never know the fear that these same machines once inspired in the men who faced them across a smoking battlefield. A child leaning over the barrier at Bovington to peer into a tiger's open hatch sees a curiosity from a history lesson, not the machine that once made an entire company of infantry drop to the ground at the first sound of its engine. That distance, between memory and object, between the terror of 1944 and the polite hush of a museum floor, is itself part of what these surviving tanks now preserve. Somewhere between the scrapyards of the Ruhr, the frontier of the Golan Heights, and the polished floors of a museum in rural England, the story of Germany's abandoned tanks finally came to rest, not with a final battle, but with a slow, uneven scattering across the entire post-war world, one machine at a time, until almost nothing of that once feared armored fleet remained except memory, steel recycled into other lives, and a handful of survivors kept, quite deliberately, so that no one would ever forget exactly what they had once been capable of.